A Guten Erev Shabbos. Once upon a time, there was a righteous person, a tzaddik, who wished to travel in anonymity. He didn't want people to know who he was. He went from village to village, depending just on the kindness of strangers for hospitality. He came to a certain town and asked if he could find a place to stay at the home of the head of the community. This community leader was happy to have important guests stay at his house because it added to his prestige, but he was less interested in having common travelers as guests. So this hidden tzaddik was welcomed into someone else's house, much more humble accommodations. Years later, when the tzaddik's identity became known and his reputation spread all over the land, he again visited the same town. This time, rather than come on foot with a knapsack, he arrived in a carriage drawn by 6 horses. The same community leader was still in the same position, and he made it known that he would be honored and pleased to host this renowned guest. So the tzaddik told his assistant to send the horses to stay at the man's house with a message. He said, "Years ago when I came, you were not the least interested in having me as your guest. I'm the very same person, and now you've reached out to me to extend your hospitality. Nothing has changed with me. The only difference is this time I came with horses. So I assumed that was what impressed you. So I sent what impressed you to be your guest. I'm happy to stay with the family who welcomed me last time around." Avraham's nephew Lot had absorbed the unfortunate attitude of his locale, the city of Sodom, with regard to others. If having guests enhanced his prestige, he was happy to host them, just like in the story. But regular folk didn't interest him that much. This is the lesson drawn by one of the commentaries, Pardes Yosef, from the different way the travelers are mentioned as they appear to Avraham and later to Lot. Our portion this week of Vayeira begins with God appearing to Avraham, which itself contains several lessons in welcoming guests, and the very end of the parsha is Akedas Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, which we read every single day of the year in the prefatory morning prayers of the Siddur. It's truly something to reflect upon constantly. However, sandwiched in between these two landmark encounters between God and man is absolutely critical insight for us into interpersonal relationships, how society is to function, and how we're to get along with and cooperate with and even care for our fellow human beings. At the beginning of the parsha, the 3 malachim, 3 angels, messengers, or travelers, however you will, show up at Avraham's doorstep, or his 10th step, I guess. He makes a great fuss over them, inviting them in and insisting that they wash up and sit down and enjoy a meal that Avraham's household prepares for them. When subsequently 2 of them appear at Lot's threshold, it says, Vayavoyu shnei hamalachim. It says 2 angels arrived, and Lot goes to bow and greeting and welcome them. Here they're called specifically malachim, because if they appeared just as people, anashim, Lot wouldn't have been interested. The city of Sodom had developed an unfortunate reputation for its lack of hospitality and even efforts in the opposite direction. Not only were travelers not welcomed, they were not welcome. Apparently, once in Vilna, a few centuries back, the communal leaders were meeting to draft a city ordinance to prohibit poor Jews from the outskirts of town from entering the city without special authorization. They asked the Vilna Gaon to come to an emergency meeting to be there when they drafted this new bylaw. The Gaon was irritated to be called away from his learning, and he asked them, "I thought you said you needed me here to discuss an important new law. This is not new at all. It's the same attitude we read about with the citizens of Sodom." The Midrashim are replete with tales of the inhospitable nature of Sodom. Not only how they made their guests' lives miserable, but how they treated one another poorly as well, and embittered the life of their community. There are plenty of tales, but let's focus our attention in another direction. Avraham's intercession on their behalf. The cities of Sodom and Amorah were so lacking in proper conduct of Bein Adam L'Chaveiro, interpersonal relations, that they merited destruction, along with several neighboring cities, 5 in total, at the hands of heaven. Destruction by the hands of heaven. God's relationship with Avram was such that God decided to let Avraham know what was in store for these cursed cities. Immediately, Avraham pleaded their case. Most instructive to us here is that Avram didn't simply accept God's judgment when it would cost other people their lives. He did not acquiesce or excuse or explain away the erasure of a community. Well, they were sinners, they had it coming. Rather, he sought to emphasize their merits, find the good, and take action on behalf of others. It's likely that the citizens of Sodom themselves would not have advocated for one another with such enthusiasm, yet Avraham did so immediately. Where the fate of others is concerned, Avraham did not sit idly by, did not assume that it was probably for the best, did not figure that it was someone else's problem. He went to the source. He challenged God, and he gave the struggle to advocate for others everything he had. Our Talmud study group learned in Brachas, page 10a, that one should always daven, even if the end seems at hand. One can, and indeed should, pray. Avraham immediately beseeched God to do justice and at very least, spare the righteous who were among the wicked, who may have been too enmeshed in the society to free themselves. And this really is a subtext of the entire Parsha. The headlines of the Parsha are God's visit to Avraham at the outset, the three angels, travelers, Arabs, who visit and announce to Sarah that she'll have a child, destruction of the cities and Lot's daughter's incest in the middle of the Parsha, and at the end, the Akedah, binding and near sacrifice of Isaac. These are outstanding moments or events in history meant to show us by example what to do or what not to do, what attitude to have in various situations, and so on. However, looking at the Parsha across the breadth and depth of it, what it's saying is that we should go out of our way, go to almost any lengths, and we should make a supreme value of how we treat each other. How do people interact with one another and societally in interpersonal relationships? Seems to be the lesson here, at least as much as any of the yearnings toward the divine. The values conflict in the opening verses of the story say it quite clearly. Abraham is enjoying a visit from the Almighty, the Master of the universe. And yet, he turns aside from God to welcome three dirty, thirsty wayfarers, who may well be Arabs. They may also be angels, but Abraham doesn't necessarily know that yet. Nonetheless, he welcomes them in, makes them comfortable, and directs a feast to be prepared to fill their stomachs and slake their thirst. Truly, taking care of the material needs here of others takes precedence for Avraham over his own spiritual needs. Can we say that looking after others' well-being becomes Avraham's spirituality? The stories of Sodom and its inhabitants' blithe unconcern for one another is the basis for their meriting destruction. More than any particular act which might be seen as immoral, their inhospitability, their isolationism, their indifference to the fate of one another, to say nothing of their fellow human being non-residents, alerts us to the need for attendance to this moral point. In fact, Pirkei Avos gives us two perspectives. When it says in chapter 5, someone who says, what's yours is yours and what's mine is mine, this is the median characteristic, shali, shali, shalach, shalach, zu midu beinanis. But others say this is the characteristic typical of the inhabitants of Sodom. V'yesh omrim zu midas Sodom. On one hand, each keeping to themselves seems to be the modicum of civility that we can expect. Or do we say that the unwillingness to share, either in one's own well-being, to share it generously with others, or to share another's misfortune or grief and offer comfort and shelter, that marks the nadir of immorality? Rav Moshe Avigdor Amiel, who was chief rabbi of Antwerp, later of Tel Aviv, explained that this Mishnah is talking about two scales, one for the individual and another is a measure of the community. An individual might say, mine is mine, yours is yours. For one person, that's a median. That's what you can expect. They're not a tzaddik, they're not a wicked person either. However, a community, Rav Amiel explains, is held to a different standard. A community cannot tolerate this isolationism. It must rather be concerned with all within its borders and even beyond its borders. If it fails in this, it's considered as immoral as Sodom. So the Parsha is saying in nearly all of its scenes and incidents that our engagement on the horizontal plane of human connection and concern is what makes us what we are. The vertical plane, the connection with God, with the divine, is also important, but God doesn't seem to mind when we turn away for a moment to welcome tired travelers into our tent. Or maybe better, the lesson is to integrate the two. It's without question important to be a mensch. We have to care for others, be concerned for others, advocate for the plight of others, take others in when they're needy. That's what's required of every good citizen, although many shirk the responsibility. Yet if that's all we do as Jews, we've left much of our mission unaddressed. We have done the minimum that's required of every member of civic society, but we've done nothing to transform society. Perhaps the calling of a Jew is to serve God, connect with God, answer God's call to us for self-improvement and self-awareness and even self-abnegation in the face of the divine human encounter. And yet, when the call of duty to attend to the suffering of another arises, we cannot say, I'm busy with God, I'm busy with my own spirituality. A true servant of God never really turns away from God. It's in the care of and concern for God's children that we respond to the highest level of calling and service. Shabbat Shalom.